The crimes, the criminals, why did they do it? Who got hurt? Did they meet justice or commit the perfect crime? You'll find all the clues at Jim Harold's Crime Scene. Welcome to the Crime Scene. I am Jim Harold, and so glad to be with you once again. And today, a lot of times we talk about things like historic murder cases, and whether it be Jack the Ripper or Jeffrey Dahmer or things like that. But we're going to talk about someone who in many ways was one of the greatest mass murderers of all time, just in a slightly different way. I'm talking about Jim Jones, and we have the author of the new book, The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and the People's Temple, and our guest is Jeff Gwynn, and we're so glad to have him with us today. He has been an investigative journalist, award-winning, and a best-selling author of numerous books, including Go Down Together, the true untold story of Bonnie and Clyde, The Last Gunfight, the real story of the shootout at the OK Corral and how it changed the West, and Manson, the life and times of Charles Manson. Jeff lives in Fort Worth, Texas, and we're so glad to have him with us today. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Jim.
So, maybe this is something that people haven't thought about as much in recent years. I was a little kid when this was happening. I was like 7 or 8 years old and remember seeing on the nightly news back before the cable channels these horrible kind of helicopter shots of all these bodies and the mass suicide at Jonestown. But a little bit, I kind of think Jim Jones has been maybe a bit forgotten to the mists of time. Is that just me, or do you think that's correct? And if so, why did you decide to tackle this subject?
First of all, I think you're right that at least what really happened in Jonestown, it has been obscured by the years since. This was 1978. What we have left to theoretically remind us is the phrase, don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Which has come to mean, don't be an idiot and follow an obvious lunatic into predictable doom. And the fact that it wasn't Kool-Aid and mostly people didn't drink it and that this was mass murder rather than mass suicide was entirely lost. I was in my early 20s when this happened, so it's still very vivid for me. I think for people my age, the big three would be the Kennedy assassination, Guyana, Jonestown, and of course 9/11. The reason I chose to write about it was my last book had been about the 1960s. I write about eras in American history, really. And unfortunately, we remember most eras not by great accomplishments, but by tragedies.
Sure.
When you look at the 1970s, if I'm trying to bring this time alive for people your age, for instance, who were just little kids at the time, there's two things that we remember. We remember Watergate, and there have been 4,000 books written about Watergate and absolutely nothing new to bring to the table. And then you've got don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Right.
And I decided I wanted to find out what really is the story behind that phrase, and what was it about the 1970s in America that made it possible for this to happen? Because history doesn't occur in a vacuum. There are always reasons, causes for the things that occur. So that was what I set out to do, and I have to tell you, this was my 19th book, and I've never been more surprised by what I learned in any of the previous ones.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, let's talk a little bit about Jim Jones. Now, when you think about someone who goes on to great infamy, whether it's a serial killer or someone who leads a movement that turns out to be destructive, like a Manson or somebody, I think the thought is that, they must have had a troubled childhood. But didn't Jones come from relative affluence? What was the origin story of Jim Jones?
Well, to hear Jim Jones tell it, he had the worst childhood possible, being brought up in abject poverty with a physically abusive father. That wasn't really true. He grew up in a small farm community in rural Indiana called Lynn. Less than 1,000 people lived in town. And he certainly had an odd family situation. His father was a disabled World War I veteran who had been gassed overseas and had terrible respiratory trouble and what we now would call post-traumatic stress. He was a war-weary soldier who could hardly walk, let alone beat a child. Jones's mother was fanatic in terms of believing in reincarnation, that she had been a great woman in a previous life, and it was her fate to give birth to the greatest man who ever lived. So sure, coming from that, things were going to be odd, but Jones was relatively comfortable, economically speaking, as a child. The Jones family was widespread in Lynn, lived in a nice house, had nice clothes, all the toys and so forth. He was still an odd child. He belonged to all 5 churches in town, walked around carrying a Bible, and above all, craved attention. So I tried to go back and capture that. There are still lots of people who grew up with him alive. And the story then that emerges is not of a poverty-stricken child who was determined from pretty much birth he was going to do great things to help people, but a kind of squirrely kid who would do anything for attention, was an inveterate liar, and was always looking to turn every situation to his own advantage. That doesn't mean that initially, as a minister, Jim Jones didn't accomplish great things, particularly in bringing about racial integration in Indianapolis. He did. But the twig was bent early. This kid grew up as a liar and somebody who always was seeking attention and power.
Now, when you talk about somebody like a Manson or like a Jim Jones, you always wonder, there's the question of mental illness versus being, quote, evil. Do you come, when it comes to Jones, do you come down on a side of the fence? Was he truly evil? Do you think he was mentally disturbed? Do you think he was a little bit of both?
Well, there are certain psychological conditions which do not connote full mental illness, but Jones certainly was a megalomaniac. He believed in his own greatness and in his own right, his inherent right to be in charge, to make decisions that affected people's lives. So he's a megalomaniac. He certainly is a demagogue. And demagogues we often find in religion or politics, and you can always identify them if you want to. They're the ones who always claim, I'm the only one that can solve these problems and lead us out of this. They always try to make their followers believe it's us versus the rest of the world. Either you believe exactly as we do, or you are the enemy. And they make promises that are increasingly impossible to fulfill. In Jones's case, he tells his followers that we are going to set this perfect socialist example. Everyone is treated equally, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of income. And he accomplished quite a few of these things. But at the same time, he's not insane. He's not crazy. He's not inherently completely evil. He's not, let's say, Darth Vader. But he's a drug abuser. He increasingly surrounds himself by people who are going to agree with everything he says, whether it's obviously ridiculous or not. And when you get a megalomaniac, when you have a demagogue, this kind of situation builds and builds until finally you have a leader who's inevitably going to lead his followers straight into doom.
Now, in the early days in Indianapolis, was it a case where, right away he started kind of being duplicitous when he had his church there? Talk to us about what he did in Indianapolis and also some of the unbelievably good things that he did that you wouldn't think would be possible. You talked about the civil rights work and being recognized. I guess someone called him like a leader. Somebody at some point called him an American Gandhi. I mean, that's amazing to me. So let's talk about, I guess, some of the good works and some of the works of Jim Jones before it totally went south.
Well, what you have is you have a young minister in the ghettos of Indianapolis, and Indianapolis at this time, in the late 1940s, in the 1950s, is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. Black people, absolutely have no opportunity economically, politically, scholastically to accomplish much of anything. And so those African Americans in Indianapolis who go to church are always being told by their ministers, life isn't fair, but you're going to suffer in this life, but in the next life, in the afterlife, heaven's guaranteed. But there wasn't anything for now. There wasn't anything making their lives better now. And into Indianapolis, starting as a storefront church, a rented store on Sunday, where he set up folding chairs and called it People's Temple, you have a dynamic young white minister who says, we are going to do things now. And he finds a place on the City Human Relations Commission. He eventually becomes its chairman and gradually builds a following in Indianapolis by convincing, through rational means, a lot of white store owners to open up their services to minorities. He gets minorities in positions now finally of some influence in city politics, all because he is convincing people it's right. There are no marches in Indianapolis, nothing of that nature, no violent confrontations. Jim Jones is literally moving racist mountains. And if, for some reason, he dropped dead right there, he would be remembered today as one of the heroes of the early civil rights movement, and he'd deserve it. But the problem is, at the same time, Jones is also doing these very duplicitous things. He goes out on the revival circuit and becomes an expert at fake miracle healings. And if you ever wondered how some of these preachers can seemingly draw cancers from suffering people or help the lame walk and the blind see, we outline all those tricks in the book. So he's doing good things to attract followers, but at the same time he's lying and he's tricking people into following him too. There's the dark thread and the light thread. And as the years go by, more and more the darkness overcomes the light.
Now, here's the question. Here's what I'm wondering. Now, the fact that he was very instrumental in helping African Americans and helping Indianapolis integrate and so forth, was that because he truly believed it was the right thing to do, or was it an end to a means to build a following? Here you have a community that's been victimized. You champion their cause. You help them make progress. Thus, you become elevated as a leader and you build a great following. Was it he did it because he's right, or because this is a great way to build a following?
Both. What we see so often throughout American history is a movement that starts as honest populism. We're going to give power to people who deserve to have it and who haven't up to this time. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a better world by opening up more opportunities for everyone, for the downtrodden in particular. But then, if you're not careful, if the leader is unchecked, allowed to say and do as he pleases, then it is going to shift over more and more into demagoguery and darkness. Jones, I do believe, and this was one of the hardest things for me to accept, at some level, in some part of his heart, in his soul, he truly hated racism and wanted to eradicate it. As a teenage boy, 14, 15 years old, on weekends he'd put on his nice clothes and he would take the bus into the nearest big city, which was Richmond, Indiana, and he'd go into the poor neighborhoods in town and would stand on corners and preach about racism is terrible, this is not fair, everyone deserves an even chance. And all he would get for his troubles then was getting roughed up by whites who didn't want to hear that kind of thing being uttered out in public. And all through the early years of his ministry, I have found and interviewed and identified in the book people who will tell you, because it was true at the time, that Jones was indefatigable in trying to raise up the oppressed and particularly the minorities. The problem being that that's only part of his personality, and the other part is the huckster, the liar, and the demagogue. The mistake I think we make in looking at history a lot of the time is we believe that prominent people have to be all of something and not have different aspects of the personalities like most of us do. So yes, Jim Jones, at least for a while, was a committed civil rights and religious leader. But it's also true that at no time was he completely free of trying to serve his own ambition and his own belief that he was going to be the greatest man who ever lived and could do whatever he wanted. There's no simple answer because he wasn't a simple man.
The book is The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Our guest is the author of that book, Jeff Gwynne, and we're talking all about this fascinating, terrifying figure of Jim Jones and everything that happened around his life. Jeff, then there was a move to California. He did all these things in Indianapolis, but then there was a decision to move to the People's Temple to California. Why? Why? What was all behind this? If he's doing so great in Indianapolis, why did he decide to go west, young man, as they say?
Jones made the decision that he couldn't do anything more in Indianapolis, that his ability to accomplish things was limited there. Now, in the early 1960s, the whole focus of American culture is really swinging out towards the West Coast. That's where a lot of the so-called exciting things are going to happen that culminate in the Summer of Love and Los Angeles becoming the predominant media center as opposed to New York and so forth. Jones wants to get in on that. He tells his followers they've got to move west because he prophesizes that there's a coming nuclear war. And if they stay in Indianapolis when the Russians wipe out Chicago, the radiation will kill everybody in Indianapolis too. They move to California, and of course there's never the nuclear war, but he's gotten his followers there now. He's building his church, so they just move forward. And it's in California that Jones, by very cannily using his church in some very public efforts to improve living conditions, particularly for minorities in San Francisco and Los Angeles, becomes a political power. On election day, he has the ability to not only bring thousands of his own followers to the polls, but to whip up a voting frenzy in a lot of minority and lower income voters. He can pretty much swing elections in the major cities and even statewide. And when that happens, the politicians come flocking to him. So within a few years, from being a civil rights leader in Indianapolis, Jim Jones is now a power broker in California. The governor, the mayors of the major cities, the lieutenant governors, they're all coming to People's Temple services and praising Jim Jones to the skies. In a sense, that's an accomplishment because it's bringing minorities and lower income people into positions of influence. But it's also feeding Jones's ego. And he even, for a while, starts talking about running for office himself. And I think as recent events in America have proven, we can elect some pretty unlikely candidates to even the highest office. If really good investigative journalism had started bringing Jim Jones down in the mid-1970s, there's a damn good chance we would have seen Governor Jones, Senator Jones, and because he never aimed low, we might even have seen President Jones. And believe me, that would have been a scary situation.
Yeah, if you think about mass suicide, you could have done it via nuclear weapons. It's terrifying to think of the implications of something like that. Now, how large was his church out in California when we're talking about members? How big did this get?
By the peak of Jim Jones's influence, there were probably over 5,000 active members of People's Temple located in San Francisco, and around the country, hundreds of thousands of supporters who constantly sent in money to the extent that People's Temple's coffers were loading up 30 million or more, much of it in foreign banks. But the thing about Jim Jones that is most amazing, and it's especially true in California when he's growing his congregation, Jim Jones's followers were in no way brain-dead zombies just willing to follow anybody who said something catchy. People's Temple became a highly eclectic group of individuals, many of whom are brilliant leaders. We're talking great, successful young professionals. And the people joined this church, which was not a cult, by the way. Cult has such negative connotations. They gave up what they had to join a church that they believed would set such a great example of equality and respect for everyone that the rest of the world eventually would want to emulate them. They weren't setting out to force people to believe as they did. They weren't trying to change the laws. They weren't trying to take over the country. They just wanted to set a good, generous example. And to this day, you can find people, particularly in California, who benefited from the free drug rehabilitation clinics People's Temple had, marriage counseling. They had free food and clothing for anyone who needed it, no questions asked. And here's the one that knocked my socks off. People's Temple set up full college scholarships for ghetto kids who otherwise would never have been able to get away from the streets. Picked up the whole tab for these kids to go to college, get educations, do something for themselves, make something of themselves. And of course, all this is lost because of the great horror of what's going to happen in Jonestown near the end of the 1970s. But Jones attracted people for the right reason, and then he held them to him, of course, by being duplicitous and by gradually becoming a worse and worse human being, isolating them until it was too late. I mean, when you end up in the jungles of Guyana, hundreds of miles from civilization, that's the point of no return.
And here's a question for you. You said that things happen as a product of their times. And, for example, the 70s, people were looking spiritually. It was outgrowth of the 60s. You kind of think the New Age movement, even though maybe it wasn't called that at that time, was getting a lot of traction. People were open. Maybe in previous years they've been very closed and these things weren't talked about, but it was the spirituality. Was that part of the chemical mix that made this work for Jones in terms of getting this large following?
That's very perceptive. That was a big part of it. People in the 1970s, particularly after Watergate, there's a lot of mistrust of the government. Almost like in the days of the Great Depression, a lot of Americans are seeing the government as a potential enemy. At the same time, because government hasn't worked as people have wanted it to, there's an increasing spiritualism. You know, maybe we have to get back and change things working through the church. And Jim Jones gloms right onto that. I mean, he fits perfectly. He's telling people the government can't do the things that a church can. And second, if you're part of what we're doing, the government is probably against you. And so he gradually convinces his followers that the United States government is the enemy. When the investigative pieces start coming out in the mid to late 1970s, and it's good, solid work because Jones is physically abusing some of his followers, and that comes out. He's trying to prevent anyone from leaving the church, and he uses extreme methods. That comes out. There's a lot of money flowing into People's Temple that's flowing right into foreign bank accounts. That comes out. But Jones can still convince the majority of his followers that it's all lies, that people are making these things up and the press is lying to you. Do you believe me or do you believe them? And by that time, of course, his followers have given up so much to be part of his movement that it's human nature not to say, you know what, I was wrong, I was fooled, let me out of this. And instead to say, no, it's the government, it's the media, they're lying to us, they're against us. So the more he was attacked from the outside, the more his diehard followers believed in him. In effect, even though he lost his power base in California, he gained even more adherents from the people who'd been following him all along.
Were there warning signs, though? I mean, were there things that people, maybe there were some people who did leave and said, no, this just isn't right? Because Jones was carrying on some pretty bad behavior, if I understand correctly.
He was, and there were lawsuits being brought against him, everything from child custody to people claiming they'd been defrauded of their property, and a group named Concerned Relatives, people who had family members in People's Temple but believed they were being exploited, formed. Jones fled to Guyana because of growing political and legal pressure in the United States. Jonestown had been intended all along simply as sort of an offshoot of People's Temple, a foreign base where in the middle of the jungle they could start a working farm and pass out the resulting food supplies to hungry communities all through South America. It wasn't meant to be a huge camp, instead more a small settlement, maybe a couple hundred people. But Jones flees there in the mid-1970s, bringing with him almost 1,000 followers. And so suddenly you have all these people literally isolated from the rest of the world. The jungle is impossible to believe how damn near impenetrable it is. And I have been there with guides, and now because the jungle's overgrown, you have to cut your way in through the triple canopy mess to get there. I mean, these people, once they're in Guyana, it's Jim Jones or nothing, and he knows that. And within this camp, the drug abuse increases. Jones is increasingly paranoid, and more he becomes convinced that what he needs is some final great gesture that will make his name live forever in history.
Now, he goes to Guyana, but people in the States are concerned for their loved ones. What happens?
The particularly concerned relatives, but lots of other individuals too, begin contacting their elected officials. Something's wrong here. You've got to help us find out what's going on. In San Francisco, in the Bay Area, there's a congressman named Leo Ryan who is concerned by what he hears. And what he announces he will do is he will personally go to Guyana to make an inspection visit. And if he finds that people are being held against their will, he'll insist that they be allowed to leave, and if Jones won't let them, well, then the United States government will go in and do what needs to be done. Ryan is a master at public relations. Just before he goes to Jonestown, he's had himself anonymously placed in the California prison system so he can see how prisoners are treated. He's gone up to the Arctic Circle and thrown himself in front of baby seals that hunters are about to attack. I mean, he's a publicity hound. And when he finally goes over to Guyana in November 1978, he brings with him a media contingent, film crew from NBC, reporters from the Washington Post and the San Francisco papers, and members of the concerned relatives. He is going to make a big publicity hit out of going into the jungle and confronting this strange guy, Jim Jones. At least that's his plan. But of course, Jim Jones is looking at it another way.
Now, again, you know, this is the cascading event. This is what sets everything off, doesn't it?
Very much so, but I also believe if Leo Ryan hadn't shown up, in Jonestown to bring matters to a head. Something else would have made this happen. Jones is increasingly paranoid. He's creating paranoia in his followers. They're out working in the jungle farms all day long. They're exhausted at night. And instead of just being able to eat a healthy meal and go to bed, they get skimpy portions, and then Jim Jones going on for 3 or 4 hours about how the government's closing in. He begins having what he calls white night drills, when he tells his followers that any minute the army's coming in, we've got to prepare to defend ourselves, and they have to stay up all night guarding the perimeters of camp. Once, he even tells them to thwart their enemies. Here's a vat of Flavor Aid, which is what they drank rather than Kool-Aid. They couldn't afford Kool-Aid. Everyone has to drink some. And when they do, he tells them it's poison and they're all going to die, but that this will be a grand gesture to show their disdain. Only after everybody has had some to drink does he tell them, no, actually it isn't poison, this was just a test. So later on November 18th, 1978, there are going to be a lot of people who willingly sip a little Flavor Aid because they think Jim's just doing it again, just another test for us.
Right.
Only to find that this time it's the real thing.
Wow. Now, I think it was mentioned in the book somewhere that, and this kind of brings it full circle and is really chilling. Did Jones admire the fact that Hitler decided to commit suicide as opposed to be taken by his own enemies?
I was actually able to find some relatives of Jim Jones who grew up with him in Lynn, and they recall that during World War II, when all the other 11 and 12-year-old boys were running around playing Allied soldiers, Jones identified a lot with Hitler and the Nazis. He didn't buy into their persecution of the Jews, but what he loved was the showmanship and Hitler's ability to command large audiences. And, of course, when the war's over and Hitler has killed himself in his bunker in Berlin, to Jones, that's an example of a great leader refusing to allow his enemies to capture him, to bring him down. He defies them by committing suicide. So that seed was planted many, many years earlier. And even during his ministry with People's Temple, in his sermons, Jones would regularly try to talk about how throughout history there have been incidents where beleaguered armies or leaders were willing to take their own lives, that this is a courageous act of revolution and not, something sick like group suicide. So he's trying to prepare them for it. When Ryan shows up and goes into Jonestown, and remember, there's over 900 people there that day. When he's ready to go, only 15 people have said, you know what, I want to go with you. As far as Ryan's concerned, Jim Jones has proven his point. Most of the people who are in Jonestown want to be there. But to Jim Jones, Ryan being able to leave with 15 of his followers is just the beginning. That means more congressmen will come, more people will want to leave. And what's Jim Jones going to look like if he's left sitting out in the middle of the jungle all by himself? So this is going to be the grand gesture. He sends a hit squad after Ryan and the so-called defectors in the media. They open fire at an airstrip 6 miles away. Ryan and 4 others are killed, and there are others grievously wounded. Back in Jonestown, Jones gathers everyone, tells them the congressman's dead. He says, I didn't have anything to do with it, which is a lie. And now they're going to be coming for us. So this is the time we have to make this revolutionary gesture. We have to step over to the other side. He thinks everyone will line up sheep-like, drink Flavor Aid laced with cyanide, lay down, die painlessly. It doesn't happen that way.
And, I mean, you can hear the recording, and it's so chilling. It's chilling to just hear what he says.
Not only that, you can hear the screaming in the background. And there are a few people who were there that day and for one reason or another has survived. So what you read in my book is not third-hand, it's first-person accounts. And the makeup of Jonestown is important to understand with what happens here. You've got over 900 people, but 300 or so are children, and we're talking infants and toddlers who can't make decisions for themselves. Another couple hundred are senior citizens, old folks in their 70s, 80s, even into their 90s. And they're being cared for in Jonestown. If they don't do what Jones wants and everybody else dies, they're left out in the jungle and they're not going to last more than a day or two. Within the other 300 or so remaining adults, maybe a third, worship Jim Jones, believe he's the second coming of Christ, that anything he says has to be true. But then you've got a couple hundred more who, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. But Jones has surrounded the pavilion in Jonestown with armed guards. The babies are dosed first, but what Jones hasn't accounted for, death by cyanide is one of the most painful, horrible ways to die that there is. Your body can't take in oxygen anymore. You go into convulsions. You froth at the mouth. It takes a while to die in agony. And when the first babies start dying like this, and you can hear it on the tape, people are watching, and they're horrified, and they're screaming, and they don't want to do it. And Jones, on the tape, is saying, this is no way for real socialists to act. Die with dignity. They're not doing that because it's painful. It's just a little bitter tasting. And people are trying to get away, but there are the guards. Now, the next thing I'll tell you is absolutely true. I have been to Guyana. I have seen the autopsy reports. Yes, there were some people who took the poison voluntarily, conned into it by Jim Jones. But there were many, 100, maybe more than that, who refused. And the ones who refused were held down and forcibly injected. And you could tell this because when the bodies were found, there were abscesses on these people where the needle had gone in to their arms, their legs, their abdomens. One guy was injected in the temple. This was not mass suicide. It was mass murder.
Wow. So, I mean, what can we learn from this for society? I mean, we've had other incidents, smaller incidents, Heaven's Gate, for example, I think in the early 2000s or late 90s maybe. We've had other smaller incidents like this. And, of course, we have terrorism where people in the name of religion will blow themselves up and try to take everybody with them to make a religious point. So my question is that what, if any, lessons does Jonestown have for us to prevent it and any lessons learned?
The reason it's worth understanding Jonestown today is that we continue as a society to follow demagogues, people who promise us, I've got the answer that nobody else has. The things we can do to exercise better control so there are fewer Jonestowns. We're always going to have incidents where religious or political fervor boils over into tragedy. If we can't entirely eradicate it, we can control it better. If you've got organizations calling themselves churches looking for tax exemption, we have to have a more rigorous vetting process. What exactly are you doing? Show us how the money is distributed. You have to keep a better financial eye. We have to try through the media to help people understand the tactics of the demagogues. I'm the only one that can save you. I'm the only one who understands this. Believe in me and realize everyone else is the enemy. In politics, we need to be a little bit more stringent on free speech is one thing. Indoctrination is entirely another. And third, just as human beings, we need to be educated to be more skeptical. In a society where people increasingly think it's desperate times, nobody cares about me, I'm just an an anonymous cog. We have to find ways to make people feel more valued as employees, as human beings. What Jim Jones did was take advantage of current events. He could tell people that the government's the enemy. Look what's just happened at Watergate. Look at Vietnam. If he were alive today, he'd be recruiting by using religion as a basis. Only good Christians, good believing Christians can be trusted. Everybody else is coming into this country and trying to blow you apart. All demagogues use current events to their own means, exaggerating the dangers, trying to find people who will buy into it. That's what Jim Jones did. If he were alive today, he would have mastered social media, because that's the new most effective means of mass communication. And I guarantee you, he'd either be heading up a megachurch or he would be running for public office and do very well. We have got to be more discerning. And that's the lesson that Jim Jones and Jonestown can teach us.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion about the road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Our guest has been Jeff Gwynn. Jeff, I assume people can find this book anywhere fine books are sold.
Yes, they can.
Thank you for joining us today. Great insight.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Wow, what a cautionary and frightening tale. And it's one of those things, I think, any time in life, when someone says they have all of the answers, be very, very careful. And folks say, well, this couldn't happen again. But don't be so sure. Be on the lookout. Certainly, I believe in religious faith. I think it's a great thing, and faith in general. But don't blindly follow someone. Just a thought based on our show today. We thank you for joining us on The Crime Scene. I hope that you will subscribe to the free podcasts. Actually, an easy link to do that is just go over to jimharold.com/subscribe, and you'll have the links to the appropriate programs and so forth. That's jimharold.com/subscribe. And then you'll find, whether you're on iTunes, Apple Podcast, or Google Play on the Android, you'll have little banners there you can click to subscribe. We'd really appreciate it, because that's how people find out about the shows. We thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time on The Crime Scene. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.